Good evening and welcome to Redcat, the Roy and Edna Disney CalArts Theater. My name is Mark Murphy. I'm the executive director and I want to welcome you and thank you for coming. I apologize for the delay while we tried to do the delicate math of trying to get everybody seated. Ooh, look, another seat. Is that available? There is one down here. Redcat is a project of the California Institute of the Arts. It stands for Roy and Edna Disney CalArts Theater, and I want to take just a moment before we start tonight's presentation to explain this is not our common configuration, but this special seating arrangement was developed to accommodate the set for Peach Blossom Fan, a production that opened last week, is a reimagining of a 17th century Chinese opera directed by Chen Shijing and runs through April 24th, music and multimedia performance. I hope you'll come back and visit us again for this production or others. There's a calendar, red and black calendar in the lobby. I would like to thank Unji Ju, the curator and director of our gallery, for originating the series chat, a series of discussions in the gallery and some in the theater about topics of importance to anyone who thinks. And we're very pleased to be working collaboratively with SCI-Arc on this event. It's great that by having Redcat downtown, CalArts and SCI-Arc can collaborate in that way. To introduce tonight's speaker, please allow me to introduce someone who's constantly, every day, reimagining our downtown, Tom Gilmore of Gilmore and Associates. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome. My first time here. Most of your first time here as well. That's not unusual in downtown right now. There's a lot of firsts going on in downtown right now. This hall is a first for downtown right now. The work we're doing down on Spring Street and Main Street is the first in a long, long time. And we're in a very special place in time. SCI-Arc is a first for downtown. It's hard to imagine what's coming up in the next 20, 30, 40 years here in downtown. And it takes an unusual combination of people to be able to think about these things in a rational way. It involves the private sector, involves developers, architects, academics, neighborhoods. It involves an odd consortium of individuals that begin to think of the city as something of an animal, something that is going to grow and breathe and eat and sleep. And we've got to figure out how to feed it and how to take care of it and how to turn it into the next great thing that it should be. I found myself in a funny place. Right after we started doing the Old Bank District, I was invited to join the board of SCI-Arc. And I have to admit I was a little bit out of my depth, as I am now. And I went to the first board meeting on the west side, and I was sitting amongst a group of people, none of whom I knew. And they were all talking about the plans for perhaps moving downtown, and some were excited and some were less excited, and one of them was very sort of stern and maybe a little cynical, but he had that sort of strange magic in his eyes that said that if we do this, we're going to do something really dramatic, we're going to do something really fascinating, and we're going to turn the world on its ear. And I really was tempted to say, who the hell does he think he is, Owen Moss? And it turned out it was Owen Moss. The second time I met Eric, he was coming downtown, he came to the Palace Theater where we had offices. And we were talking about the future of downtown because we have to talk about the future of downtown. We don't have any choice. Our future is linked to the future of downtown. And Eric got involved in the conversation, and all of a sudden you could see that this bizarre, wonderful nexus of design and intensity and urban planning and business were all firing in his head and acting like a new engine in a new car in a very, very different place. And Eric was doing some things with us that really made me excited, that really made me think that this was not going to be just a development plan, that this wasn't just going to be a mass transportation plan, that this wasn't just going to be an affordable housing plan, that this was going to be a design plan. And that we were going to need as many people as we could in it, but we had some really interesting people to start. And those people were the people who were at the top of their field. Eric, Tom Main, Frank Gehry, and numerous others that were now looking at design as one of the most important things in urban redevelopment, that urban redevelopment wasn't going to happen as a function of an economic model, it was going to happen as a function of a design model. And I welcomed it. Eric has since spent many, many days with me sitting at coffee tables and restaurant tables going over the future of the world and where we think it ought to go and where it shouldn't go and how it's all going to be. And I hope he shows you a lot of those visions tonight. But whether it was working on the Hayden tract or working on some of the studies he was doing in St. Petersburg, in Mexico City, in Vienna, Eric has always had a wonderful, extraordinary mind that leads us to the next great place that I think we're going to go. I think to sum up Eric, and why I enjoy his company so much and his great restless brain, he said himself in his last monograph in his third book on architecture, and he said this: architecture moves where the paradigm moves, and the paradigm, however powerful, is provisional. It keeps moving, so I keep looking. Eric Owen Moss is a man who keeps looking, and I hope we all keep looking, because in his eyes, in your eyes, is the future of Los Angeles. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Owen Moss.
I'd like to thank CalArts and Redcat Theater for an extraordinary opportunity to address a number of issues that concern us, that we all share, that a number of you are involved in, participating in downtown Los Angeles. Can I have the lights down, please? All the way down in front. Let me have the first image. Welcome to SCI-Arc. I arrived at SCI-Arc 5 days ago. I mean that facetiously. Please don't misunderstand. By the way, did I thank Tom Gilmore for an extremely friendly and charitable introduction, and we'll see if I can live up to all of that. Anyway, welcome to SCI-Arc. I arrived at SCI-Arc 4 days ago. SCI-Arc, as you know, is located on Santa Fe in a building that runs about a quarter of a mile in length along Santa Fe. There's an 8-acre piece of property to the west of SCI-Arc. Staff, faculty, and students have rested their automobiles in that location undisturbed for probably 3 years. So, confronted with this, as you're now confronted with it, I speculated with several members of the board of directors who are working with us on a problem that I'll outline for you about what the next steps might be in resolving the current situation. But what occurred to me was that the SCI-Arc situation is so fundamental and so symptomatic of the circumstances in Los Angeles, of how Los Angeles came to be what it is, how it's evolving, and where it might go. So what I'd like to do here is to tie the SCI-Arc situation conceptually to the general situation, specifically to the general situation of Los Angeles, what it might be, where it might go, and I think inevitably I'll have to generalize, draw certain kinds of conclusions, to which there are obviously exceptions. There are subtleties and nuances and complications and contradictions in this city, as we all know. Nevertheless, I think the first operational principle is we've only just begun. The future is in front of us. Next, please. I don't know that Los Angeles would ever be accused of being a bastion of physical beauty, probably not LA. But there is something from a certain distance on a certain day, poetically at a certain time, a little bit ethereal, moving, which in a sense is part of my sense of what the city is. It's not distilled, it's not fixed, it hasn't assigned particular weights, so it's still fluid. It's a canvas, to borrow the much used metaphor. It's a horizontal canvas, and I think there's an extraordinary opportunity in front of us to fill that canvas in now. Next. There has been a lot of discussion, cartoon and caricature of Los Angeles as a city in motion, which makes itself, and before the concrete is settled, remakes itself. And I think, given the right context, that sense or that ability to keep it alive, to keep it moving, and an apprehension for what's fixed and permanent and durable is a useful element in the making of a city. It may be that we're coming to the point, that our generation will arrive at the point where we can say, it's the Loop, it's Midtown, it's downtown, it's fixed, but for the moment, that fluidity and that we're amenable to change and evolution, I think, is one of the essential ingredients in understanding the essence of what makes this city what it is. Next. And there is no, I think importantly, I mean, this might be horrendous in Boston or difficult in Vienna, but I think for us there isn't yet a pro forma which obligates or defines a relationship between old and new, either in style or content or scale. I think that actually is an asset, and there's something else which is important for a youthful city to understand, which is the difference between old and new is not substantial in time. This is not a historic city, notwithstanding the fact that there are a number of people who would like to compare it to historic cities and other cities. I think this takes us in the wrong direction. So there is not yet a civilized pro forma for old and new, and I think this is clearly a strength of the city. Next, please. And the ubiquitous suburban discussion that you all know and have heard over and over, substantial horizontal pieces of land, single-family houses, the ubiquitous automobile and all of that. And there was probably a time when, not so long ago, that Los Angeles, at least from the outside, was understood as suburbs and a collection of suburbs, and that simply was the sum and substance of the city. I don't think that was true, but if it were true in former times, it's no longer the case. Something else is on the move. Next, please. And then, of course, this came out of the local newspaper a day or two ago, which is the statement, the census statement, the statement of growth. The city is growing, that the city, and substantially so. So we ought to keep in mind that the city we study, the city we attempt to understand, is not a fixed condition. The buildings are moving. I'm not sure whether the land is moving, the population is moving. So it is, in fact, in process. So what we solve has to be solved not only in anticipation of what we have, but in anticipation of what might be coming next. Next. And this is of some interest to me, and I think it is said genuinely and somewhat facetiously. Los Angeles has been a very fertile field for urban prognosis, urban discussion, urban evaluation. It's the city of the future, it's finished, whatever that statement is. And any number of people who have evaluated Los Angeles in books and in articles and so on have come from the outside. So very often the image of Los Angeles projected to people who live here comes from people, next please, with a very different pro forma and a kind of conceptual mindset about what are the constituent parts of a city. As if one could say, if the city had this, and if the city had this, and if the city had this, and if the city had that, that constitutes a city. Absent those pieces, not yet a city. With those pieces, you got yourself a world city. And this you probably know. This is the view from London, and I think exemplifies an effort to define this city with priorities and an organizational mindset that comes from outside the city, which I think means you miss the point of what Los Angeles is and might be what Los Angeles has to offer. The remark about LA on the couch is a difficult one. In the first place, it's, as I said initially, it's difficult to make generalizations with all the caveats. But if it were possible to give the city a persona, and if it were possible to put that persona on the couch, it's conceivable that it's a persona in conflict. And I think the conflict is this. The conflict has to do with whether we should be subscribers to an a priori external model of what the city should be, or whether we should use our strength, our invention, our independence, our courage, and the anomaly of this urban circumstance to see the world in a different way and send it out somewhere else, as opposed to retrieving what originated elsewhere. Next, please. Another view, but a similar subject matter. This came out of Time magazine, and I know a number of you have seen it. It was an article much passed around, and it has to do with the coming of world cities, colossal cities, cities that are growing in an unprecedented way. But I think, again, the issue has to do with a generic model. This one from the outside in, Banham's also from the outside in, but this one saying essentially there are pieces that are consistent with big scale cities, assets, liabilities. Los Angeles is one. And again, if you measure up, if you share those assets, if you correct those liabilities, we'll give you a world city. So again, it has to do with an attempt to define Los Angeles as part of a club or group or way of seeing urban development in the world. And I think if one follows that line of argument, one concedes, I think, what are the real strengths and idiosyncrasies that this city has to offer to us in this room, in this city, and to the world. Next, please. We're not actually New York. Nor are we Fifth Avenue next. Although there was a time in the late 40s when there were people who thought the Miracle Mile might be our Fifth Avenue next. Nor are we Paris and the Champs-Élysées. Nor are we, I think that's La Rambla in Barcelona next. Nor are we the First District in Vienna, next. Nor are we the Ginza in Tokyo. Again, I think the instinct to measure Los Angeles against cities which conceivably are as different from each other as they are from Los Angeles is not helpful to Los Angeles, and in some cases only seems to result in a kind of conceptual inferiority complex for the city of Los Angeles. So for all of our mental health, this is one that we want to avoid. Next, please. But this is the other side of the discussion, and I think an important one. This goes back 8 or 10 years and has to do with, I think, individual strength, individual conviction, individual courage, and the sense that Los Angeles is a field which, given the inclination to take responsibility, one can actually begin to make a city plan, an urban strategy, and individual pieces of architecture, and send that message not only into this city, but out into other cities around the world. They should learn from us. Next, please. And this is, there are some instances of this. This is Michele Saï in Paris. Next. Tom Main in Madrid. Next. Gary in Berlin. Craig Hodges and Ming Feng very recently in Tokyo. Next. And Eric Moss, the National Library in Mexico City. Next. Los Angeles ought to understand itself, I think, as a perpetual laboratory and a venue for experiment. And I think this extends well beyond architecture and planning. I think fundamentally to the absolute audaciousness of this city, and this city as an idea. This is the opening of a very early aqueduct. So for a city to develop where no city would likely go, in the desert, here we are at the early stages of that, making it work, whatever the Sierra Club may say in retrospect. Next. And in the middle of the 19th century, big city, desert, the city and the land. Next. And this, although the subject matter nominally changed, I think it actually is germane. It could be associated with Los Angeles' relationship to the movies and to Hollywood. That's not really my intention. It could be related to the politics of Chaplin during the Second World War. Most of you know those politics and the history of those positions. But my sense of the image had to do with a different sensibility, which is not so much the man against the machine, not that either, but the importance of individuality, courage, idiosyncrasy, independence, all of that, as metaphorically represented by the man in opposition to a process which he can confront and alter. Los Angeles. Next. And many examples of that. These you all know. This is Pierre Koenig, case study, House 22. The city is absolutely a laboratory in the 20th century, no question about it, at every scale and in every endeavor. So this is Pierre Koenig, as I said, next. And Neutra, the Lovell House, next. And Schindler, next. And Charles Eames, next. And a different frontier with a different perspective, which takes us into areas that I think belong to many industrialized manufacturing cities that are now facing NAFTA and the reconstituted sociology that comes as a consequence of what the current headlines refer to as outsourcing, as manufacturing leaves the city, and this is an industrial, ex-industrial area, Culver City, central Los Angeles. Next, please. Which becomes a very different venue, I think, a frontier, and with promise as illustrative of a way of dealing with this subject matter in other places in this city and around the country. Next. 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 In terms of a political structure, the last project I showed was from Culver City, which is on the west side of Los Angeles. And I want to say a word about what I would call structure, infrastructure, in terms of instincts that both pull the city apart and others which knit the city back together. And I think this is fundamental in terms of our understanding of what the city is and how it makes decisions and the kind of decisions that it's likely to make. So all of this you know in one form or another, 5 supervisorial districts, 15 councilmanic districts, and overlaying one another, and then the Glendales and the Burbanks and the West Hollywoods and the Culver Cities and the Beverly Hills and the Santa Monicas, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly, in a political sense, in terms of making large-scale decisions with some capacity to implement the aforementioned, this is a very difficult proposition, and it leads to this happenstance piecemeal structure, which may give us an opportunity to do something, or to see the world in a way which, for example, the city of New York, which is antithetical to Los Angeles in terms of its political organization, couldn't deliver. I think we need to see it as an opportunity and a strength, and not always lament the fact that we can't homogenize the city next. And then there are the, I think, the physical or natural geographic pieces which constrain or limit or define the city. Obviously, the Pacific Ocean, which has always seemed to me, for all its beauty and size, that it is very much the edge of the city and the perimeter of the city. And I can think of an example like Seattle, where the land and the water are like this. Los Angeles, land and the water a little bit more like that. So it's substantive, it's significant, it's certainly part of our world in an environmental way, but the capacity to see it and touch it is limited by access. Next, please. The mountains, an early drawing here of burgeoning Los Angeles. By the way, note the river minus the WLPA enclosure, the Los Angeles rivers, the mountains which divide the city from the valley. So ocean, mountains, two primary physical, geographical, and natural elements. Next. And then the infrastructure, which actually has, I think, fascinated a number of us for a long time. The river here, the river now encased in concrete, enormous swaths, mile upon mile, of concrete, of infrastructure. Here the river, next. The power grids, next. The tracks, ubiquitous tracks, next. And of course the freeways. And what's particularly fascinating about these is they would be, I think in my terms, the synthesizers of the city. If the political structure tends to segregate and create the happenstance, these pieces of infrastructure, the power grids, the river, the freeways and the tracks pull it together, but they pull it together in a very peculiar way because they seem to be pragmatic, technical, engineering solutions defined extremely narrowly. If not to call them single-minded, perhaps better to call them simple-minded. And I think the next step may be to use these pieces of infrastructure and to introduce a kind of conceptual livability so that they're not just ways of getting from A to B by train, sending water, sending power by automobile. Not just A to B, but are in fact livability C. Next. This is an example of a project we did about 8 years ago, which is I think, in an inspirational sense, related to the idea of buildings in this city and infrastructure. It's about 115 meters long. It's about 12 meters wide. It was done for Kodak, and it is a building in the air over a road. So it adds another dimension, a livability, a use to what heretofore was simply an access route for unloading and offloading of trucks. Next, please. And another, I think, very fundamental piece of order and organization in the city, and I think quite unique to Los Angeles, these very long adventures north-south. This happens to be western. I think this is Sepulveda, La Cienega, Ventura, Sunset. I guess this is Wilshire, and this must be Olympic. But these enormous boulevards, which in some sense traverse the city and take on very different characteristics as they move from north to south and east to west. So another potentially unifying element in the order and organization of the city. Next, please. And I think as a result of the happenstance of politics and the segregation of political authority, there is another element which interests me, which is the high-rise building, big buildings, high-density buildings, which seem to be scattered all across the city, from the valley here, Warner Center, next, Westwood, next, Century City, next. We can see a little bit of the Wilshire Boulevard discussion. The high density as single elements or individual elements, as opposed to a kind of coalescing or coagulating of high density. This is a recent proposal passing not long ago through the Planning Commission and the City Council for two high-rise buildings in the central part of Los Angeles. This is the building in the air over the road, which was one of the few buildings to be built in the central city. And of course, this building, because of its height and its prominence, has a very different role as a big building, both for inhabitants inside and for those who will see it outside. You know you're not at 49 and Madison. Next, please. And then downtown similarly. Next. Next, I'd like to talk about a hypothesis that relates or brings us back to the sense of this city as youthful, adolescent, in the current lexicon, fresh. Does that work? And it has to do with an emphasis or a burgeoning energy in a particular area, which seems to dissipate and dissolve and then either go somewhere else or metamorphosizes sometime later as something else. And there are a sequence of these. LA, hot and cold. This is Musso and Frank, which I think actually opened in the 1920s on Hollywood Boulevard, which has any number of stories at the moment, not so promising, but we'll see what happens. Next. And Westwood, which was apparently the center, at least in the west side of Los Angeles, and that too has dissipated and deteriorated. Next. And then Melrose Avenue, which, as it's explained to me, was the hippest of the hip at a certain point, and now that seems to have gone somewhere else, as hipness tends to do. Next. And the Sunset Strip, which is reincarnated or metamorphosized on any number of occasions and still going. The latest incarnation seems to be a very particular interest in hotel and office building development. Next. And the Ambassador Hotel, which for some of us holds a very poignant history in terms of the Kennedy family, but in addition is part of Mid-Wilshire and the Miracle Mile, and a way of seeing Wilshire and the city. And I think, by the way, Wilshire and the city, with the city being the west part of the city, the downtown being the eastern termination of the downtown. I think this was a traditional idea. I think it's absolutely erroneous. Nevertheless, Wilshire on the way to downtown, the eastern end of the city, not so. Nevertheless, looking to see what comes next for the Ambassador Hotel. Next, please. And there are any number of these examples, and we could go on for a while, and I won't, but the Coliseum in the 30s and redo in 1984, and a very serious discussion and a poignant discussion about social pathologies or the evolution of same in that area and the likelihood that a football team would come back. I think this was once the home, you'll have to correct me, but I think of USC, of UCLA, of the Rams, and of the Raiders, and I think now all have disappeared. So the remaking of the stadium, in a way, like a piece of the infrastructure, the river, the tracks, and so on that I described, with a very different opportunity to bring it into a new life or a new kind of livability is one of the options, and I think that's being discussed today. Next. And the omnipresent Mr. Gilmore, I remember this discussion, many of you will know Pete's, and I looked at this shot when we were putting this together this afternoon, and no one in sight, so I assume it was shot at 6 o'clock in the morning, because it apparently is one of the hottest tables in the city. And I think this is quite fascinating, because apparently 2 years ago, nobody wanted to invest a dime in this project. It's at 4th and Main, as you know. So the idea of a restaurant, never mind a successful one, was not plausible. Nevertheless, Tom and associates pushed it, and it seems to have resulted in a spectacular success, as is the housing which sits on top of it. So keep in mind, this is at 4th and Main, hot and cold, and again, this seems to be now warming and a promising area downtown, looking to the immediate future. Next. I'm not sure I can promise durability in any of this. I think these changes, hot and cold, have happened for a long time, over a number of years. And we'll see at what point the city coagulates, forms, and firms its positions and its priorities. And this may be 2 venues where that might take place. One, Grand Avenue, that discussion very much part of the present discourse on the city. You can see illustrated here to your left. And then on the right, the future of SCI-Arc. I think what's important is that both of these projects or areas, and I wouldn't want to imply that they're of the same scale and of the same consequence, but significant in terms of their ability or lack thereof to give us what LA is as an adventure, as an experiment, as an exploration, as an investigation, but not to give us back La Rambla, the Champs-Élysées, the Ringstrasse, and all of that. And I'm referring to Grand Avenue. Next, please. There is a precedent, obviously, for the building on the hill, a la Mont Saint-Michel, perhaps, a building which by its nature, for better, for worse, or for both, tends to isolate itself. I can remember wandering through the central city area, looking up at a lamppost and seeing a banner which says, "This is your Getty," in the central part of Los Angeles. I don't know how many subscribers there were to that since, but I think the Getty has positioned itself as a type on a hill, in many ways disassociated from the life on the ground, on the street corner of Los Angeles. Next, please. I think Grand Avenue, whatever comes out of that project, probably doesn't want to take that route. Next. And then the SCI-Arc side of the equation, if it's indeed an equation, if it is, it's an inequality, but nevertheless an equation. So this is Santa Fe Avenue running north, aptly named. This is an old freight depot, as you may know. Next. And I have to say, one of the most remarkable, promising, astonishing site areas in this city, or any city, as a venue or a number of venues for invention, innovation, prospecting in design and planning. The tracks, as I mentioned, the power grid, as I mentioned, the river, as I mentioned. There have been discussions of air rights projects sequestering the tracks and then programming that platform in various ways, including extending that from time to time over the river and connecting the city of Los Angeles, which with its poor relation, which is sometimes referred to as East Los Angeles. So the opportunity to build, to plan, and to build over the tracks, to remake the river, to cross the river, to connect with Los Angeles. And by the way, the bridges, I understand this is not the 59th Street Bridge we're looking at. Nevertheless, the bridges are intriguing, remarkable, if not beautiful, and they're very much out of the livability framework for us in the city of Los Angeles. So the bridge, the river, the experience of those ought to be brought in and integrated in our conception of the remaking of the city as it moves east, not west. Next. Looking in the other direction, SCI-Arc, and a very particular interest on SCI-Arc's part in involving itself in a very extroverted way with the neighborhood groups, with conditions on 3rd Street, with conditions on traction, with a conservancy with respect to the bridges and so on, so that whatever comes out of this opportunity, and keep in mind that the real opportunity is not SCI-Arc yes or no, or the site adjacent yes or no, but a reconceptualization of the entire area in the city, tracks, rivers, SCI-Arc West, and so on. Quite a remarkable opportunity, and an ecumenical one, and a participatory one, a critical one. Next, please. So back to Grand Street and SCI-Arc, and a proposal that I think Mr. Sussman and Mr. Petsuras have shared with me, and it's an intriguing one. Again, let me restate this. The sense that downtown is the east end of the city, and that the city in substance is West Los Angeles, is an idea we have to jettison. Looking from Grand Street east, the prospect that First Street could be connected to Grand, that First Street could be a connector to the SCI-Arc area, so that the development of this piece of the city and the growth of this piece of the city could belong to each other, and one could be a destination to and from the other. Next, please. This is a sort of percolation or influence diagram, and it is simply meant to suggest that this is not Mont Saint-Michel, and it's not the Getty, and the intention of this project ought to be to coalesce, to integrate, and to share on either side of Grand, along First, and in the area around SCI-Arc to the west, the tracks, the river, and on to East Los Angeles. Next, please. And then finally, SCI-Arc itself, you can read the caption, and I think you know that SCI-Arc moved into this area, the old freight depot. Very importantly and decisively, I think, SCI-Arc understanding that its fight for what I have to call, and I apologize a bit for the name, for the nomenclature, contemporary architecture. So SCI-Arc's push for contemporary architecture from the early 70s until the end of the last century, I think it's fair to say, has been won. And as we saw in Paris and in Madrid and so on, the fruits of that, the success of that, is now part of the discussion in the making of cities all around the world. So the fact of the matter is, SCI-Arc can't camouflage its radicalism anymore as the center of that discussion, because that discussion has moved to a number of places. SCI-Arc certainly supports it. But the coming of SCI-Arc downtown, I think, had to do with looking, although not necessarily knowing exactly for what in specific terms, but looking for a venue in the city as a part of the city to make the city to see itself not only as an introverted and a maker, introverted institution and a maker of architectural poetry, but in a more mature way, a participant in the reconception, a reconstitution, reimagining of itself in its area, and a participant in the discourse of where the city will go. Next. And the remodeling of the SCI-Arc building. Next. And this is certainly encouraging that a venue in that part of the city will consistently draw huge audiences who participate in the discussion of planning and design all around the world. You should know that SCI-Arc has a population, staff, faculty, students of about 550. So you can imagine an old building, a dilapidated building, distinguished by broken bottles and blowing bits of the Los Angeles Times, and all of a sudden 550 people descend, inhabit, occupy. So housing, professional services, restaurants, all of that kind of growth now, including substantially increased prices and rents, all of that as a consequence of SCI-Arc adventuring into the center of the city. Next, please. And of course, not to suggest that this is a Hollywood production, next please, but a list of the famous and infamous, the participants in this discussion, ongoing discussion, and a dense and intense one, on the future of the SCI-Arc building and the property, in this case, immediately to the west. Next, please. Just to give you a little bit of the background, the Santa Fe, the SCI-Arc building, the subject property, next. And the divisions, I think this is of some importance, albeit a level of detail. SCI-Arc represents what's called Parcel A, strangely enough. And then B, C, and D, SCI-Arc is interested, has offered to buy A and D. And the presumption is that B and C will be developed in conjunction with what the city, who helped us come down to this area, has called a unified conceptual plan, which again, we would like to generalize so that the making of that plan is responsible not just to SCI-Arc, not just to this site, not just to the neighborhood, but to a discourse that has to do with all of this, and in addition, the First Street connection to Grand in this area. Next, please. Just for your information, this belongs to the LA Conservancy. SCI-Arc has been designated as a historic building. So this is the profile as you go further west. You get to go higher. Next. And some studies, there has been a SCI-Arc study group, some architects, some students, some developers, the neighborhood organization, the Conservancy, even members of the Planning Commission, looking at, not so much literally, but organizationally, whether issues of pedestrian circulation, the extension of traction, future of Third, protection of the bridge historically, and next please, the gathering as a destination, as a pedestrian destination in the area where SCI-Arc locates its lecture hall, potentially a retail space crossing the line. So a sense, conceptually, never mind the specificity, of understanding this as unified, as a neighborhood, as a strategy for the revitalization of the area, less so the conventional constraints of typical commercial development, and those constraints we all know well. Next. And then this plaza and the extension of the SCI-Arc lecture hall, which would be used, of course, by SCI-Arc and by the community in that public plaza for events, discussions, exhibitions, and so on. Next, please. And we began to look at issues of what one could see. Next, please. Positioning strategically, and these are not buildings and don't pretend to be, nor are they building strategies and don't pretend to be, but they are efforts to understand the interrelationships between pieces that constrain SCI-Arc from the outside, that property, but also offer opportunities beyond the site, and again, particularly to the east, toward the east. Next. 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 So the SCI-Arc study group producing a number of those documents, I think very critical in bringing together Conservancy neighborhood groups, not so much to reiterate the scale and purpose of what exists now. This was never the intention, but more to acknowledge those pressures and then to see what opportunities existed beyond those. Next. And this is the alternative that's been offered to us or handed to us on demand. This is properties B and C, and there is a 5-story block that essentially fills those two properties, and then phase 1, which is anticipated to be 40 stories, and phase 2, which is anticipated to be 50 stories. I don't want to debate this in detail, although I have to say that unlike the SCI-Arc study, this is as specific as it gets. So this is a specific architectural intention for the making of that site on parcels B and C. Next. So it's come to this, I think, for SCI-Arc. SCI-Arc has an opportunity to draw on the invention and innovation that is part of its history and part of its antecedent, both in architecture and in planning, that I think runs all the way back to the audacious, as I described, the beginnings of this city. The debate on the future of that site, and indeed the making of that entire area, is with us now, right now. And I would ask for your encouragement, and I would ask for your support. Thank you very much. What's next? Good question. Anybody want to toss something this way? I think we would like to leave those questions to be answered in as broad a way as we possibly can. I think we're not interested simply in replicating the scale, building type, and material so that what is new is simply an extension of what's old. I think we would be interested in buildings of scale if they came with other amenities that were productive in terms of community needs and community uses. So I think the answer to the question statistically or numerically would be difficult, but I think the possibilities are enormous, and the buildings could actually be quite substantial on both sides of SCI-Arc, on the east of SCI-Arc and on the west. And I think all of the participants in this discussion, and I think it is a discussion and it is participatory, will have to be party to that. There aren't any deals where SCI-Arc will say, we'll do this, you give us this, and the hell with everybody else. I mean, ultimately this will have to be settled with the councilwoman and the mayor, the neighborhood groups, faculty, staff, students of SCI-Arc. I mean, I understand I'm saying all of the right things. Nonetheless, in this case, I think that will be the only way to the conclusion that I think we want to reach. And again, I think we're looking at this as an opportunity not simply to solve specific concerns that have been concerns for SCI-Arc for many years, to find a home, to have parking and housing for its students, but to be part of the promise of what I call that ethereal view of Los Angeles, that one you can't quite touch, doesn't quite coagulate, to start to work on that campus, on that canvas and make the next city. Max.
Say a few words about how the existence of the large homeless community downtown affects all the planning of that.
The question had to do, and I think this is always a difficult question, and I don't know that it's one that I can solve. And I think I said when I started, in order to protect myself, that however we would generalize these propositions about what constitutes Los Angeles, what it is, and how it works, there will be difficulties and anomalies and exceptions. And I have a sense that that problem is not a building problem. It's not even a planning problem. And I think you might agree, it's not even a local problem. Without starting to preach, but it has something very substantial. I mean, you walk into Trump Tower, you walk over homeless. It's not peculiar to the 4th Street Bridge in Santa Fe. And I think, frankly, that this is a public policy question to do with how resources and assets are allocated in perspective. What makes the society, what makes the culture. I think if you don't touch that subject, you wind up shoving these people and those people over here in a substantive way. I think you avoid the problem. So I would say it's a political priority question, a public policy question. I'm not sure that one can hand that to SCI-Arc and say fix it, because we can't. That is correct. They own A, B, and C. We offered to buy A. We were credible buyers of A, and somehow, up to this point, it went in a different direction. We're in the process of negotiating purchase of both and D, and I don't see any reason to think if reasonable people sit at a reasonable table and had a reasonable discussion, maybe there's some optimism that we could reach a result. We'll see. Been a lot of discussion about that. I think I should say in terms of housing, the opportunity for housing, as we discussed that situation in detail with the neighborhood groups around SCI-Arc, I think what we were interested in doing, it may sound too absolutely decent and friendly, and in a political context, maybe not quite plausible, but we were very interested in a real ecumenical neighborhood. We wanted people who worked in the city. We wanted people from Grand Street and the City Hall and USC and County USC and East LA and students and faculty and all of that. So we were very much looking for an ecumenical community. Again, you saw early in the discussion the happy days, this homogenized. So our sense of happy days is something with a very different kind of face relative to the city and the complexity of the city and the neighborhood. So we are very interested in a more complex mix of housing and purpose and use on that site and in that area. And it's my sense that the neighborhood shares in that, and I think the councilwoman does as well. And I think that would likely be a pro forma, at least an initiative, for what might take place over the tracks if we can find a way to pioneer that discussion. Would SCI-Arc students be involved? I think SCI-Arc students at this point are a voice, and a significant voice among many voices, and they certainly are a voice to be heard. I wouldn't want to try to represent that community as entirely homogeneous. I think there are very different points of view. There are very different communities. There's an undergraduate community and several graduate communities, nor are they homogeneous. So somehow these very diverse opinions will have to coalesce and be brought together in one form or another in order to share the discourse. And so I think that will be the role of the SCI-Arc community. SCI-Arc community, I have to say, has already made its presence felt in a substantial way. There was an attempt to enforce a plan. I don't want to offend anybody, but might very well have gone in Santa Clarita. Probably nobody from Santa Clarita who came all the way to this discussion. But 2 stories of block, 4 stories of sticks, north to south, east to west, passing as a housing plan, dumped on A, B, and C, on B, C, and D. And SCI-Arc students visited the city council in number and along with the neighborhood people, and made it clear that that was nobody's idea of intelligent planning and design concept. You know, we'll give you what you like. I think we can put the neighborhoods together with the political will and the conceptual thinking. I think the long building actually is an unusual one, and I think that unusual kind of building, relatively thin and relatively long, have to be exploited. I think it's quite unique, and I think it'll fit in extremely well. I wouldn't worry about it. Maybe. Well, I think that's a good question. Right. Well, I think at a more ethereal. You know, I think we're not, I mean, if we're talking about beauty, we would have to get to the next slide, which I didn't share with you, which actually shows how unlike the beauty or the ethereal sense of the city those buildings are in a literal way. So if we want to talk about a stylistic critique of those buildings, which I think is extremely premature, if we want to talk about buildings, I think the question is, are big buildings okay on that site? If that's the question, the answer is yes. I think that there isn't any particular problem, and I think the study that we did, the SCI-Arc study group, made it clear, and the neighborhood has said as well, that big buildings conceptually are not a problem on that site. It has much more to do with how the buildings are organized, how 3rd Street and Traction and the SCI-Arc site are dealt with. And if those buildings are simply imports from another city in another part of the world where a very different argument was made for their purpose, and they're essentially transports from another place. So as conceptual thinking, this didn't look to us like it represented a sensibility that was cognizant of or interested in the opportunities that exist in that area. There may very well be big buildings. The fact that these buildings are equitably disposed in all directions is suggestive, I think, that they belong to a different city and a different organizational strategy. And there is further the low building, which I referred to as the block, which more or less fills the site. So one of the discussions in terms of park and recreation, those kinds of issues, is rendered essentially impossible. And finally, there was, when SCI-Arc entered the city, a very important discussion, vague though it may be, of a unified plan, and this was an aspiration to an understanding that involve the entire area, not just simply a commercial real estate endeavor. What can we put on B and what can we put on C? Hasta la vista. So this was not, I think, our position, but in terms of the question of whether big buildings are okay, tall buildings are okay, I think they absolutely are. Yes?
I would like to agree with what you're saying.
Please do.
Yes, as an artist that lives in the artist district, which is right around the corner,
Yes.
that's one of the last areas that's actually sort of wild, and that's why we go there, because we experience a certain amount of freedom that we can't find in other neighborhoods. And what you're proposing would actually create a neighborhood that's just not any other neighborhood in Los Angeles. Okay, I don't want to say that, architects aren't special, because they are, but you're discounting that area, which is very special to us as artists and fine artists and graffiti artists. And I, first I've heard of it, but I think that as artists and fellow artists that are seeing, we should also really count. And I think most of us don't want big buildings with lots of people, like normal people that really.
Well, you have to be careful, just like we do, otherwise you're liable to lose the whole audience, in which case you can't win. So this is not for me to make a judgment at the moment about what constitutes normal and what constitutes,
When you're bringing in, okay, artists generally are a little bit different and
Yes.
experience life differently, and also, strive to break boundaries and live in environments where they can experience life maybe a little wilder. Now, what you're proposing will also bring in, stores, community, commerce, police, men on bikes and security and things like this, and that will really drive us out, actually.
well, I think we have to be careful, and I said this is an ecumenical voice, and I think I meant that we value who you are, and we value what you do, and we do that. That's so.
But you do see how that happens, that we're trying to find places where.
Well, I think and I think we would have to discuss this, and we will. I don't think we're looking at a unidimensional city any more than the Pleasant Valley suburb. There are areas of enormous promise in that zone, including what happens on the site, high buildings or not, and the river, and the tracks, and a whole series of opportunities. We're not making a proposal. So when you talk about what I'm proposing, I'm not proposing anything except an intelligent discussion on the possibilities that will include you and others. That's all. Someone else is making a proposal, we have to evaluate that and discuss that with those parties. My sense is they're willing to have that discussion, so are we, so we'll make it work. You're on the list. Let's go to Pete's. Thank you very much.
Doing that. Yeah. And she thought I was gone and she could just sneak up and like, ha ha ha.